لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين حتى تأتيهم البينة.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are starting the study of the divine speech in the Quran, and we are trying to understand the critical questions about the Quran, that we can have the miraculous proofs that the book is truly a divine speech. And step 2 of the Quran of our journey will start also to have the source of the strength that helps you to answer your questions and evoke the awe of the Quran, of the beauty of the divine power. Today we're gonna cover about the micro studies of the Quran. This divine speech program, we want to introduce the Quran in 2 levels, the micro and the macro. Through this unique, the literary approach, the framework is established as a Quran as a living text. So today we're going to cover about the micro studies of the Quran. For instance, what is an ayah? What is the real translation of ayah? And what is the meaning behind ayah? Is it a verse? Is it a sentence? And what are the categories is allocated in ayah or surah itself? So surah is going to have a major study, which is a macro study of the Quran, I might call. So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, let's start through it. The Quran, as you know, is made of 114 surahs. Sometimes people call it as 114 chapters, but there is a problem of calling it a chapter, because chapter has analogy or chronology. Chapter is separated based on events. For example, in chapter 1 they talk about this particular topic, and in chapter 2 they talk, it has a progressive type of thing, progressive type of chronology, be it's by time, be it's by development of plot of the story, be it's from easiest chapter to the complicated chapter. Chapters also can be defined as let's say from something smaller to larger in volume type of basis. But in Quran that's not the same thing, as you have realized, because there are smaller chapters, I mean there are smaller surahs in beginning, and there are smallest in the end. There are some surahs which will, based on their title, has nothing related to that, or the title has related to the meaning, the content of the surah has only few types or few pages are actually mentioned about that. So today we're gonna answer about few questions about what surah and ayah really is. Particularly when, as I mentioned, when you have a chapter in a book, you start from chapter 1 and then 2 and 3 and so on. And for instance, when you go to chapter 4, they will never repeat what has been said in chapter 1. They will use this actually they can repeat the same thing, but they will put sort of like a footnote that they will say refer to chapter 1, but that's not how it's in the Quran. There are a lot of places in the Quran whereby one surah repeats in another surah. I mean, the ayah is repeated in the same several surahs actually. So they will take the concepts that they have already covered in chapter 1, 2 and 3, or maybe summarize it in chapter 4, or leave it a footnote, as I mentioned. So the idea of chapter behind is that they are building an argument or building a plot little by little towards the final end. And another thing about chapter, if you change the sequence of the chapters, they won't make any sense to you. But they can. But why we cannot make the same concept towards Quran is because if you say surah is a chapter, there are another people who have learned, for instance, only Surah Baqarah and that fully makes sense to them. So, or people who memorize the 10 last surahs, and it fully makes sense to them, and they fully can apply them and take the meaning out of it. So they do not need that chronological story build or chronological thing built to understand the last 10 surahs, because it does not have any relatively to surah 2 or surah 3. You try to understand what I'm trying to say by what is the meaning of the chapter behind, and what is how we are actually limiting the power of the Quran by calling a surah a chapter, which it has a unique name and a taste of it. For instance, if you take any other book and make the chapter 10 as chapter 3, or switch places 3 to 10, the meaning is totally gonna change. People will not know what is the story behind, or how did the story progress till here, or how it escalated to this level. So the book won't make sense anymore, right? So it is possible in Quran that people have actually studied separate surahs or made a tafsir of separate surahs, and it totally makes sense to them, because there is no any progress of stories, or as I mentioned, it's not a chapter. Again, that's the valid point. So we can argue that from the literary perspective, that doesn't make it any chapter. So based on the history, a chapter have to have a sort of a chronology, for instance, from early time to the oldest time. But ask yourself a question: do we see that in Quran? Do we see that the Quran was brought by eldest chapters first and newest chapters later, or based on the timeline of the history, which is again proves it wrong, because there are chapters mixed in beginning which were brought in the Makki time. If you ask yourself a question, if Quran was in chronological order, then Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq will be in the first ayah of the Quran, because that's the first word that have been actually the first ayah that came, and the ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah will be at the very end. The Quran is not organized by chronological order. It's not made, as you understand by now, it's not organized by time or by volume, by size, or by story, or by how is like the development of the story as in the book. So if you argue that Quran maybe or maybe you think that Quran is organized by subject, which again it's not organized by subject, as I mentioned before. So if you ask, for instance, what's the subject of Surah Baqarah, it's a very difficult question to answer, because everything is in Surah Baqarah. Every single peak that you take in the Quran is mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah. So you cannot point an ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah and say definitely this is gonna be the subject of Surah Al-Baqarah. And you cannot do it because it's vast topics covered there. For instance, or you cannot go to surah like Ibrahim and for sure say that I know Surah Ibrahim is about the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, which again it doesn't cover all that. There are other topics also covered in there. And when you start, for instance, reading Surah Ibrahim, you will realize there's many things doesn't have to do anything with Ibrahim alayhi salam. Or for instance, you might be saying Surah Al-Baqarah, you have to be 286 ayats about the cows. A cow does come up in the ayat. However, there are many things that have nothing to do with cow. The chapter usually have a title. So chapters have a heading and a name, and it tells you everything about the chapter. It's in my view that from literary perspective, to call surah of the Quran a chapter, it's unique and it's an own entity. There is no other book that have surah. It's only the Quran. Every other book can have chapters and can have sections. The Quran only has surahs. In other words, Allah from the beginning set his own standards to build the Quran. For instance, when you imagine you give your essay to your teacher, and the teacher corrects your essay, he or she will tell you, correct it here, bring this paragraph down because there is a new topic or new statement that you're trying to talk here, or he will correctify you by giving you the certain amount of standard of literate background of talking, or literate of writing, of bringing out your points. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created his own standard in the surah of the Quran, and it's built in unique way that cannot be compared to any literature in the world. That's why you cannot compare the Quran or surah to any other literature in the world, because the units of other book is chapters, but the units of the Quran in macro view is surahs. So this is the biggest mistake when non-Muslims they want to study the Quran. They will be referring as surahs as chapters, or the non-Muslims will be saying that the Quran's chapters don't make any sense for them. The chapters are organized. So you might be saying, well, listen, my friend, that the surahs of the Quran doesn't have to do anything with chapters. So the non-Muslims mostly they're missing out the point altogether. Thank you for listening to our lecture. It's brought to you by Bayana Production. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification button, and stay tuned.